So, good afternoon, everyone. My name's Alan Winters from the University of Sussex, and I'm chairing this very excellent panel that's going to be talking about COVID-19, lessons for trade policy and for cooperation, things that we all love in this particular group. I'm not going to spend any time talking. I'm going to introduce the guests very briefly. Each of them is going to make a presentation, and then there will be time for questions and answers at the end of the session. It'd be good if you would put your questions into the question and answer box on Zoom, and I will try and monitor them and feed them back to appropriate members of the panel. Although I think the panel will be able to see all of the questions, if I understand correctly. So without my absorbing more time, let me introduce the panel. We have Sabine Weyand, who is a Director General of Trade in the European Commission, Simon Evenett from St. Gallen and the founder director of the Global Trade Alert, Ken Ash, who is a former Director of Trade in the OECD, and Caroline Freund, who is a Director of Trade from the World Bank. A real star-studded cast. And so we'll get on with it. So, Sabine.
Hello, greetings from Brussels. I hope you can hear me well and see me all right. I would like to make 4 brief points by way of introduction. And I'm hoping to be able to gain some time in my presentation, which I intend to use in the discussion then. So without further ado, the 4 points I wanted to make. Point 1, COVID is often seen as a watershed moment that divides the world into pre-COVID and post-COVID, into a before and after. But I would say that COVID has been much more of a catalyst of developments that were already underway before and which COVID has exacerbated rather than created. And the 3 main trends I see in this respect is the decoupling between the US and China that we have already seen before and which gained renewed vigor. Secondly, the rise of economic nationalism, a trend towards protectionism and managed trade, which has been transformed into managed economy in the first heat of the crisis, because obviously national governments were confronted with the need to ensure the supply of basic goods and services to their population in a situation when the economy was almost coming to a halt. So that is a trend that has been exacerbated quite considerably, and we have to see where it goes further. And the third trend that the COVID crisis has accentuated is the weakness of global governance institutions, not least the WTO, but not only the WTO. What we have seen before is already a trend to replace the rule of law by an approach that you could characterize as might is right, and where it is the bigger partner dictating the conditions. That's the first remark I wanted to make. So not a revolution, but an acceleration of trends. The second point I wanted to make is about supply chains. And here again, I would make a distinction between the immediate reaction to the COVID crisis, the first knee-jerk reactions which led to export restrictions when the world was confronted with a demand shock in the first instance in terms of supply of personal protective equipment. And it's a knee-jerk reaction to which EU member states have not been immune. We have then put some order back into the internal market, but the price for that was that for a few weeks, we also had to run an export authorization system, which then fortunately we were able to let lapse after a few weeks. But in a way, if you then look at a slightly longer term issue, you see that actually global value chains, far from being the cause of the problem, have shown their value in this crisis. And I don't want to use an example from Europe. Let's look at Korea, for instance. which from a net importer of test kits for COVID turned into a major exporter thanks to the global supply chains into which their companies have been embedded. So in a way, I think market economy and open markets have proved their value in this crisis rather than anything else. More longer term, I think what is often forgotten is that global value chains, however, are not something that is static. They are permanently changing. And what we also need to keep in mind is that it is not governments that or public authorities that organize global supply chains, it's business. And here I think the crisis does have an impact on how business goes about this. We had global value chains very largely organized on the need for cost efficiency. And I think here we are seeing now a shift from a just-in-time approach to a just-in-case approach. If a pandemic can mean that parts of the world get shut off at different moments in time, then there is a very strong case to make sure that you have more diversified sources. For governments, I think one has to realize that in the first heat of the shock, they took restrictive actions, but I would say many of those have self-corrected in the meantime, as they did for the EU. And now the question is, how do we prevent being exposed to such a demand shock in a future pandemic? And here the discussion now is increasingly turning towards strategic stocks, strategic reserves, but also the ability to have production capacity that can be quickly reoriented. Now, obviously, both of these, strategic reserves and having the capacity to ask companies to change their production, comes with a huge cost. And that means that I think in the end, the idea that we will see a major reshoring that is not supported by a business case, I think that will turn out not to be the case because it is simply too costly for governments to go against commercial considerations in this respect. The third key point I see is the importance of facts and figures. And I don't want to go into too much detail because I guess that some of my fellow panelists will come to that. But when we were starting to have these discussions in the EU about reshoring, etc., and about our vulnerabilities, we said, well, let's have a serious look at that. So we started looking at our trade figures. Unfortunately, they are not detailed enough to make really clear statements about vulnerability, because behind 6 or 8 digit HS codes, you can find very different products, and you need to go deeper into that. You need to have more granular data. But what we saw is that for just 1% of EU imports, we have only one supplier, and that for more than 2/3, we have a large number of different suppliers. So that in terms of vulnerability through dependency is not borne out by facts at that level. However, we did realize that, for instance, on certain active pharmaceutical ingredients, we only had one or two suppliers. And that is something where we will need to see whether we can do something about this. Fourth point is then, what does this mean for the future direction of trade policy? First of all, I think we saw in the crisis that we really lacked a WTO that was able to deal with all these issues. So we really have to shore up and reform the WTO. And I'm not going to go into all the details of WTO reform. I'd rather focus now on what I see as the main immediate challenges we have. So we are keen to launch in the WTO a trade and health initiative, exactly to avoid a repeat of what we have seen in the heat of the crisis through export restrictions, etc. And we also need to make sure that once a vaccine or several vaccines are available, that there are no tariff or non-tariff barriers preventing the spread and the distribution of these vaccines, into which the EU is putting quite a lot of money to ensure that they are available not only in the EU, but also for developing countries and globally. So that I think is one of the concrete things we need to look at, but we also need to link up the WTO better with the WHO if we want to make progress, just as we need to reinforce links with the International Labour Organization and with environmental organizations in order to make sure that the WTO fits in the Sustainable Development Goal paradigm. Another element for EU trade policy is certainly our determination to try and get both the US and China back into the multilateral system. We share a lot of the US misgivings about the role of China and the impact of its state capitalist system on the rest of the world. We disagree with the US that you can tackle these things through bilateral negotiations and unilateral enforcement. I actually think that the track record so far shows that this approach of bilateral and unilateralism doesn't work. So I think we have no other chance but to try and convince China that if they are attached to the multilateral trading system, they have to make a new down payment in terms of disciplines, including notably on subsidies, on leveling the playing field more generally. And we have to convince the US that that is a better way of disciplining China and through engagement rather than through unilateral sanctions. Third track of our trade policy is to support diversification through our network of trade agreements. We have seen that this network is helpful in the crisis, and that is something we want to build on. And by no means the last point, but the last point in my presentation today is we need to look at trade and climate, because this pandemic is not totally disconnected or independent from climate change, or rather climate change may lead to future pandemics as well. So we better make sure that we have sound global governance to deal with the climate crisis, and in this the WTO and trade policy more general have a clear role to play. And that is where I would like to stop. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Sabine. We're not going to sort of have direct questions at this stage, so I'm going to pass immediately over to Simon Evenett. Simon.
Thank you, Alan, for that for the transition and introduction. The purpose of my presentation is to summarize the pandemic era trade policy dynamics that we have seen and to put them into context. And my goal is to look at the dynamics we've seen this year and the trade covered by them, to compare them to previous years so we get a sense of perspective there. Then I'm going to dig a little deeper into what we know about the trade policies in essential goods, like medicines and food. I'll then reflect on supply chains and then look forward and point out some of the dynamics that I'm tracking at the moment. I think the subject matter of this presentation nicely complements the one we've just heard from Mrs. Weyand. I think may even round out some of the arguments made there with facts. And I think the findings, when you put this year into perspective, also, I think, reinforce the conclusion that what we're seeing this year is an accelerant of previous trends, and it does not mark a particular break or revolution in trade policy dynamics. But let me get going by first discussing what we have found this year. The data source that I'm using here is the Global Trade Alert, which the team here at St. Gallen has been working on for 10 years. We track trade policy changes and commercial policy changes around the world. This year, we've been particularly busy. There's been over 1,500 that we have been able to document. And what we do is to try and identify the HS codes and the sectors involved with each trade policy intervention at the finest level of detail for world trade data. That's at the 6-digit level in the Comtrade data set. And then for good trade in goods, we can then start estimating intervention by intervention, what's the total amount of trade that's covered. And that helps us get a sense of the scale of the trade policy interventions that we're seeing this year. What I have in this first slide is a chart which shows you the measures which are ones which benefit local firms over foreign rivals. So we call those harmful policy instruments or discriminatory policy instruments. And I've shown you the amount of world trade that has been affected by them at the end of April, at the end of June, and as of this Monday. And you can see that there's been a steady buildup of the amount of trade, global trade in goods, which has been affected by policy interventions this year, which are harmful. And as of Monday, we estimate that about 6.3% of global trade has been affected. And this has progressively increased over time. When you break out the numbers, you see that for sure there's a contribution from tariff increases, but by far the largest contributions come from subsidies to local firms and export measures. And of the export measures, we see not just export curbs and controls, but also the introduction of tax-based export incentives and trade finance to large firms. As you know, trade finance has a very good public relations profile based on helping small and medium-sized enterprises, but in fact, most of trade finance supports transactions by large firms. And so we estimate that about 1% of world trade has been affected by that type of subsidization this year. Trade tax-based export incentives account for about 1.3%. And as you can see, tariff increases are about 1%. So overall, we are beginning to see a build-up, and over time we will document, of course, more subsidies to firms which, local firms which put them at an advantage compared to foreign firms. Let me be very clear, though, that the subsidies that we're documenting are not the ones like Kurzarbeit, which will pay for staff to stay at home. For us to document a subsidy, we have to show that there's a commercial advantage to the firms concerned. So paying a firm to pay their workers to stay at home when the government has shut them down doesn't confer much of a commercial advantage, and that is not distorting any of these numbers. So I make that point clear so that we understand that what we're showing here are mainly selective subsidies which confer competitive advantage or commercial advantage. So for this year, this is the build-up that we have seen. Now let's put this year's dynamics in context, looking back over the last 5 years. Now on the left-hand side, you can see if you count the number of interventions, both harmful and liberalizing, that this year has been a remarkable year. We have over 1,000 already discriminatory policy interventions, which we have documented. And we also see a large number of liberalizing ones too, around 450. And so if you compare this year to last year, we see a rise in both, but in fact, actually, we see a large number of liberalizing measures. And this has mainly been in the area of medicines, which I'll come back to on a subsequent slide. So if you were looking at counts, you would actually be quite worried this year. And it's not surprising that as the media has picked up on these different counts of the different policy interventions, that this has received a lot of attention. And of course, the fact that the essential goods are deemed essential adds to the salience of trade policy in that area. But interestingly, if you look on the right-hand side of this chart, if you estimate what's the amount of world trade in goods that was affected by harmful or discriminatory policy interventions between the 1st of January and the 21st of September for the last 5 years, you get a very different pattern. And you can see here that this year's increase, which was around 6.3%, which I showed you on the last slide, is in fact much less than the increases in world trade or the shares of world trade which were affected by new discrimination in 2017 and 18. And in 2017, there was a big jump in the use of tax-based export incentives. And this actually began to feed through and affect a lot of global trade. And in the year 2018, there was an unusually high number of financial grants given to firms that face import competition. So we can see that when you look at the amount of global trade affected, actually this year is not a particularly outstanding one. And this, I think, helps reinforce the point that things were going wrong in the world trading system well before the pandemic occurred. And this, I think, helps put this year's changes in perspective, but the counts also highlight that there's been quite a lot of action. It has not translated into as much world trade affected or covered than we've seen in previous years. So the first two slides then really cover global dynamics, and now I want to dig a little deeper into the story, into essential goods and then into supply chains. Now, as some of you may know, my team, the Global Trade Alert, combined forces with the World Bank, with Carolyn, and with Bernard at the European University Institute to track what was going on in the food sector and in the medicines and medical goods sector since the pandemic began. And what we have on the left-hand side is a chart which highlights one very important finding, which is that although there's been a huge amount of media attention given to export curbs and the like, in fact, there have been 229 steps taken by governments this year to reform or liberalize medical supplies and medicines. And so the story is not just one of trade restriction. There has indeed been a lot of trade liberalization, as some countries realized that taxing the importation of soap was not a very smart thing to do during a pandemic where we were all advised to frequently wash our hands. And so a balanced picture highlights that there has been some good news here. And of course, one of the interesting questions which people might want to reflect on when you're designing a WTO initiative is, can we lock in or at least try and encourage governments to put or keep as much of this, these medical reforms in place? Because unfortunately, some governments now are letting them lapse. And indeed, the point was made in the last presentation that some of the export controls have been phased out. About half of them have, according to our count. But unfortunately, half of the import reforms have been as well. And so there's a dynamic here which we need to track more carefully. On the right-hand side of this chart, we estimate the trade coverage using 2018 trade flows. We estimate this year what would have been the amount of trade covered by export restraints or controls and by import reforms in the area of medical goods and food. And the interesting finding is that the import reforms are covering more trade, we estimate, than the export controls in the area of medicines. In the area of food, the amount of trade affected has been much less. In many respects, the food sector has not seen the type of dynamics that we saw in the medical goods and medicine sector, and that's of course a relief to most of us. So we have then in essential goods, a problem arose with spreading export curbs, but we also had a substantial amount of import reforms. Clearly, we would like to discourage the former and encourage the latter, and that's something which maybe we can pick up in Q&A on how to do. So let me then move on to another area of concern, and this picks up again on the previous presentation where there was a discussion about global supply chains. I would argue, having looked at many of the different statements by leading policymakers, that there has been a shift, at least rhetorically, in how senior politicians see global supply chains. And it's true that some of the usual suspects, the economic nationalists, have taken the opportunity to condemn global supply chains. But we also have countries like Japan, which did not introduce an export control in the area of food or medicine. They have also taken public statements being concerned about overdependence on China and encouraging the relocation of production back to Japan. And in fact, Japan has created a fund, a $2.2 billion fund, to encourage firms to repatriate their production back to Japan and also to the ASEAN region. And there are already companies which have signed up for this subsidy. Now, Japan is not alone, and I don't want to pick on our Japanese colleagues. We do see similar statements by European and US policymakers. And here, of course, the policy mix is varied. The US policy mix seems to be much more about potentially using procurement policy and subsidies. On the European side, I think it's fair to say that the policy is still in flux. Another very interesting development, which is worth tracking, is the Chinese government appears to have concluded from this crisis that it is too risky to have their growth depend on exports, or as much on exports as in the past, and they've advocated a so-called dual circulation policy, which is encouraging firms that export to ship more to the Chinese market, and the Chinese have already introduced high-level policy documents to put that into effect. So I think one of the things we have to track is the longer-term fallout for supply chains of this type of public policy intervention. I'm not arguing that this public policy intervention will be sustained. We will see if it is, but there has been a clear material shift in how policymakers are discussing these matters. Let me wrap up by just highlighting 4 factors that I will be tracking, and I would urge others to follow too. I think the first thing we have to watch is at the rate at which the import reforms and export controls in medical goods are being unwound. Clearly, we want to discourage the unwinding of the reforms and encourage the unwinding of the export controls. And this is an area where high quality transparency, monitoring, and deliberation at the WTO could help, and in other councils. A second thing that I'm tracking and I'm increasingly worried about is about of selective subsidization by governments capitalizing on the COVID-19 crisis to essentially advance certain national champions. And we have seen some evidence of this, and we can go into examples later. A third area worth tracking is whether or not this apparent rhetorical shift of governments towards supply chains follows through with policies to encourage subsidization and reserve public procurement for local firms. And the fourth argument, which I'll be tracking carefully, is whether or not these overdependence arguments on China provide a slippery slope back to import substitution, which is of course will be repackaged in a different way. I share the view which we heard from Mrs. Weyand that the arguments about generalized overdependence have been exaggerated. If anything, there is a selective problem here which needs fixing, and this does not call for a first order rethink of our policy towards supply chains or towards world trade in general. Thank you very much, Alan.
Thank you very much, Simon, and right on time. So that's excellent. Let's move on. The next speaker is going to be Ken Ash. So Ken, over to you.
Thank you, Alan, and good afternoon, everybody, or for some of you, I guess, good morning. Let me start off by thanking the European University Institute and the World Trade Institute and Bernard and Joe in particular for the invitation. I also want to repeat something, Alan, that you said. I am former OECD, no longer with the OECD, so but I will draw heavily on work that was undertaken while I was still at the OECD. So anything sensible that I say, the credit should go to my former employer. Anything else I say, the responsibility is my own. Now, let me just back up half a step and state the obvious. COVID-19 is a health crisis that turned into an economic and increasingly a social crisis with major implications for international trade. Now, I say that because much of the early impact on trade flows was directly a result of measures that were necessary, taken by governments to contain the effects of the pandemic on the health of their citizens. So you're all familiar with the story. Cancellation of passenger flights reduces the availability and increases the cost of air cargo. Social distancing had important implications for labor's ability to handle cargo, implement cross-border protocols, and so on. So this is where the early disruption came from. Now, as Simon, I think, does an extremely good job of demonstrating that more recently we've seen measures that both expedite border crossings and measures that restrict trade, in particularly on the export side. So why is this happening? I mean, governments presumably are taking these actions to protect their citizens, but of course, restrictive trade policies also place others including the most vulnerable countries, at greater risk. So if you protect yourself, it's to the detriment of somebody else. Many governments are also striving to support domestic economic activity by injecting significant amounts of public funding into their economies. But again, not all countries have the fiscal capacity to do so. And even in those countries that do, not all groups in society are benefiting. So the result, overall, inequality is increasing both within and across countries. Now, today, the health trajectory remains unclear, as do the prospects for economic recovery, and policy uncertainty remains extremely high, all of which weighs heavily on much needed private sector investments to kickstart all of our economies. Now, I want to turn and look a little bit more specifically at trade and trade policy. And I think has been said by any number of speakers over the last day and a half, we can learn a lot by looking at some pre-existing trends and the available facts, the available evidence that we do have as incomplete as some of that is. Now, I'm going to focus on just two, global value chains and government subsidies. But of course, let's not forget that COVID-19 emerged in a world that was already characterized by high trade tensions and considerable inertia across the multilateral system. On GVCs, first of all, as early as 2011, 10 years ago, the expansion of GVCs had effectively stopped. Servicification, digitalization, and as Simon coined, creeping protectionism, all played a role in reshaping business strategies. Since COVID, these trends have accelerated. At the same time, the available evidence suggests that global value chains overall, thus far, have performed well, responding quickly to an unprecedented surge in demand for personal protective equipment and even medical and ICT services, and to a considerable shift in the nature of food demand with the closure of food service, restaurants, and so on. Let me be clear about this. Are global value chains perfect? No, they are not. Can they perform better? Yes, they can. Will they have to become more resilient? Absolutely. But the real issue is not whether, the real issue is how. So let me inject a little positive note. Hopefully we have learned or relearned one important lesson, and that is the value of transparency and the value of international cooperation to enhance information sharing. Now, I think unpacking a little bit the stark contrast in export restrictions applied to medical goods and those applied in agriculture, there's an incredibly important role, I would argue, that's played by the agriculture market information system that was created by the G20 a decade ago in the midst of commodity price hikes and some very unhelpful policy actions at that time. So while there were significant disruptions to food supply chains earlier this year, many, by the way, were much more domestic than international in nature, governments generally allowed markets to remain open and avoided making the situation worse. Again, I would argue this is largely attributable to much more transparent and much more widely available information on supply conditions, demand, stocks, and so on. So again, I would argue that when it is clear that the market is working to the benefit of consumers and producers, governments don't have a case to, quote unquote, insert themselves to protect those consumers and protect those producers. Still, the conversation today, as others have said, is very different. I used to be asked, how is it that we can enable more countries and smaller firms within countries to benefit more from participating in value chains and to benefiting more from our interconnected economies? So a good thing. This was a positive question. Today we're asked, how can we decrease our dependence on global supply chains, which presumably is a bad thing? And I would argue again that the benefits from participation in value chains and participating in global markets far outweighs the costs of doing so. Which takes me to subsidies. And again, for at least a decade now, many countries have expressed concern about the growth of state capitalism, including, but not limited to China. With COVID-19, there is growing interest in more countries in pursuing an increased role for the state in some aspects of their own economy, in response to stated national security considerations, strategic autonomy interests, and so on. So while governments are helping to support their economy today, as I've said, with massive public spending, given the devastating impacts of COVID, they are right to do so. At some point, this support has to be rolled back. A long experience with subsidies demonstrates that they are easy to introduce, extremely difficult to target to the intended beneficiary in any effective way, and even more difficult to remove. So in other words, in introducing and when introducing, at the same time as introducing necessary stimulus measures, exit strategies, ways out of the business of doing business need to be thought about and need to be introduced. So the challenge for businesses and for governments today, even while learning, continuing to learn how to coexist with COVID, is to determine how best to build back better. Trade will be expected to contribute more to a sustainable and an inclusive recovery, which, amongst other things, means that ensuring that global value chains are more robust, more resilient, and better performing, and that businesses do business, and that governments govern. That will be the expectation. This is a much more complicated discussion than the old debate between globalists and nationalists, between offshoring and reshoring. So what next for trade policy and international cooperation? Well, I wish I knew. What I do know is that we may need to think a little more about coexisting with COVID. At the same, I don't know how long this is going to last. Nobody has been able to tell me. But as we coexist with COVID, whether it's for months or a year or more, this is still the time to begin to construct that new normal that hopefully we all are anticipating sooner rather than later. Businesses, I would argue, should be prepared for higher expectations of them by governments, in some cases, perhaps even backed by either negative or positive incentives, to adopt more explicit strategies both to manage risks and increase their resilience, looking more systematically ahead at low probability, high impact events that may come along, and by improving transparency along the supply chain to identify any risk areas, any potential bottlenecks, and to be much more agile, to adapt quicker, and to be ready to adjust production systems, including building in some level of quote unquote redundancy. And of course, the debate around rebalancing the benefits and the costs of diversified sourcing versus few or single long-term relationships. In my view, governments will pursue more resilient global value chains. I hope Sabine is right. This is a short-term rather than a long-term phenomena. But it'll be incredibly important to avoid simple solutions simply because they may well be simplistic and not solutions at all. Reshoring, for example, means higher costs, higher prices, lower output, and in fact, less stability and assuredness of supply. This is not just intuitive. There's a great deal of modeling work that demonstrates that, yes, you can mitigate external shocks, but you also limit the ability to adjust to any shocks to the domestic market, the domestic economy entirely. That will result in more instability, not less, to go along with the higher costs. Governments can do a great deal, though, to get the environment more right than it is. A little more policy predictability would be a good thing. Transparency is sadly lacking. Not just detailed data, but what it is that governments are doing and what we understand about the impacts of what they do. More can be done around facilitating cross-border processes, using digital technologies more widely, and so on. A word on subsidies and the quest for an international level playing field. Here, international cooperation is absolutely essential. I think, as others have said, no country can do this alone. Subsidies and their quantum, their existence, their impact, we know much less than we should do. The distribution of the direct costs and the benefits of subsidies, we begin to understand some of that, but perhaps even more important is the need to understand the opportunity costs. So every government that I know of has fiscal limitations, even the largest. Trading off excess or excessive or massive stocks of masks against expenditures on ICU beds, on schools, on medical professionals, on education, and so on. These are very difficult trade-offs to make. And at the end of the day, yes, we need more resilience. Yes, we need some level of redundancy. Yes, we need to rely more on stocks. We also need to create more reliable markets, more predictable markets that we can count on. Final two words on the importance of international cooperation to address the needs of the most vulnerable. Within our countries, this is a challenge. Globally, it's a greater challenge indeed. And addressing the needs of those that cannot take care of themselves is something that needs to receive more attention. Finally, Alan, WTO plurilaterals as opposed to WTO multilateral outcomes and consensus, as others have argued, make a great deal of sense. I would suggest as well, though, that softer forms of international cooperation, non-binding, such as the G20, the G7, APEC, and other international bodies can deliver much more in this policy space as well. So with that, thank you, and I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you very much indeed, Ken, and again, thanks for staying on time. So the last of the speakers, after which I will be opening up the floor for questions and answers, so please do send them in through the chat, through the question and answer facility. The last presentation is Caroline Freund from the World Bank. Caroline.
Thank you, Alan. And I also have a presentation, so I'm just going to upload that now. Can you see the presentation?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Great. So I want to thank Bernard and the organizers for inviting me to this session. And I have to say that the title I found a bit intimidating, Lessons for Trade Policy and Cooperation, in part because we're in the middle of this. And I think as a suggestion, maybe we should have another session 5 or 10 years from now with the same people and come back and think about the issue again when we have the benefit of hindsight. But the way I approached it, and what's interesting is how many of the same themes I'm gonna pick up on as the previous presenters, is where we were right before COVID hit in terms of trade and trade policy, how the COVID shock has affected these trade policy, cooperation, and policy concerns. And here's where I'm going to pick up on a lot of themes that have already been mentioned, and in particular, how COVID is accelerating shifts that were already underway, and then what history can tell us about this. So first, just to say where we were before, there was this tremendous liberalization, both in terms of tariffs in advanced countries, the purple line, tariffs in developing countries, the blue line, and the rise of preferential trade agreements in the 1990s and early 2000s. And this led to unprecedented high trade growth that, as we know, was about twice as fast as income growth. So the share of trade to GDP was rising. And it was in part driven by these really big changes the fall of the Berlin Wall and the opening up of Eastern Europe and their eventual joining of the EU, the NAFTA agreement, the formation of the WTO, China's opening up and joining the WTO, the formation itself of the WTO and the Uruguay round, the European single market. So many new initiatives that lowered the cost of trade and allowed trade growth to really take off. And with this came the rise of global value chains. Of course, in global value chains, where goods are crossing borders more than once, every tariff counts and they get multiplied as they go. So these falling trade costs led to this huge boom in global value chains in this period, to where by 2008, they were about half of trade was crossing more than one border. Since then, global value chains have really stagnated. So the fall is that we show here is partly the decline in oil price and China finding more inputs at home, natural things. But there also were no major new initiatives that were helping to build on what we had seen during the 1990s and early 2000s. So trade growth had slowed. The other big shift, and this is something that came up in the first presentation as well, is really the rise of China and how that's affected trade policy. And this is from some work by Bernard and Aditya Matu that builds on work that Bhagwati and Irwin had done earlier, thinking about so-called diminished giants. What happens when you have a giant who's interested in MFN? You have a very strong trade system. You have that leadership. But as happened with the UK when their share of global trade fell and there was other catch up, they turned away from the MFN system. And it could be the case that that's part of what's driving US stance now, is the declining trade share. But without that leadership, it is more difficult to have a stable trade system. So when we think about what's going on in terms of trade, there were some situations that were around before COVID. We had already seen, as I've shown, the stagnation in global value chains. Trade tensions were high. Multilateralism and the WTO itself was under threat. Subsidies and SOEs had become a big issue. Data storage and data sharing. There were concerns about competition and the need for greater competition policy to deal with the rise of large firms and in some cases excessive concentration. It was very hard to tax companies, in part driven by global value chains, which made profit sharing easier and the rise of more virtual goods. Inclusion was an issue both within countries and across countries. Services, trade, despite our talking about it growing, it had remained around 20% of trade, though was increasingly used in goods trade, but there was a need for more services openness, and the environment was becoming a bigger issue in trade. When we look at COVID, on many of these, it's really accelerating what was going on. GVCs were stagnating. Now there's this focus on resilience and reshoring. With respect to trade tensions, we're seeing borders actually closed. We're seeing we saw that nationalism that Simon talked about on the critical goods and extending in some cases to food. Firm support programs are really building on I mean, in some sense, everything's being subsidized now to keep the viable firms in business, more digital, and the platform firms are rising. So in so many areas, COVID is really accelerating the shifts that were already happening. Perhaps the two silver linings are an expansion in business services, though tourism on the service side, of course, has been hit very hard. And then with respect to the environment, where I think this type of black swan event has led people and policymakers to recognize that things we are not thinking about as major events can happen. Pandemics have always, the idea of a pandemic has always been possible, but people put very little probability on it. And I think there will be much more concern on climate-friendly policies going forward. And so when we take all this together and think about the lessons for the future, I think the paper that came to my mind most was this work by Doug Irwin and O'Rourke from 2011 that looked at how shocks versus shifts affect trade policy. And what they find is that shifts have more persistent effects. So the geopolitics and the rise of China is certainly a shift that was greatly affecting trade policy before and will continue into the present, as well as shifts in comparative advantage, things like that. Big shocks have uncertain effects. So after World War I, the US looked inward, but after World War II, they looked outward. But small shocks tend not to have persistent effects. But we're now in a case where we have both a shift and a big shock that's accelerating that shift. So I think this is going to have a big effect. Another point they make, and I think that's something we haven't talked about in this session yet, is that shock absorbers are really critical to the trade system. So while the escape clause and the ability to stem imports when they surge, in some sense, it is a rise in protectionism. It also is something that may be needed to keep the whole system together. And I think we need to think about what shock absorbers we would need for the future for this pandemic type of situation, whether it's more stockpiling, the ability to change planes from passenger to cargo. There's lots of things you can think about, but we need more shock absorbers. Maybe we'll even look back and think the export restraints that happened served as a type of shock absorber. So these are really uncertain times. I've already talked about the rise of China, but that will change the ability for leadership going forward. But I don't think everything is bleak. The late 1980s were a time when Bhagwati and Irwin actually wrote that paper, and people thought trade was growing slowly relative to income growth. The US had lots of policies vis-a-vis Japan, and everyone thought, oh, lots of non-tariff barriers are coming into play. And then from 1990 onwards, we had this unprecedented change both in trade policy and rise in trade growth. So I think the direction we end up going, we still have to understand is very uncertain. Institutions matter, and during the global financial crisis, I think we all felt more comfortable with our institutions than during COVID. So as others have said before me, we definitely need to build up on our institutions. And then we need to protect the good characteristics of the trade system. It should be open to all. There should be predictable It should be predictable and rules-based so that investors feel comfortable investing in other markets. Non-discrimination and reciprocity make it fair. They also, as Bagwell and Steger have shown, make it more efficient. And we need it to be resilient. And then finally, we really need to address the new issues that were arising because of shifts and are being accelerated because of COVID. So this relates to information and transparency. And similar to what Ken said, I think the food price crisis is an example where Amos, which is able to show the data on food supplies and has been very instrumental now in showing that the grain supplies were ample, helped countries to restrain policies they might have otherwise taken. We need to do much better on notifications to the WTO. Export restraints, not just on medical goods, but on high-tech goods or scarce goods like rare earths are becoming an issue that need to be addressed. And finally, these disciplines on other policies that go beyond standard trade policy. We need to think about how to address them and make the trade system stronger so that it can continue to serve us into the future. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Caroline. So that's the end of the presentations. They were all excellent and thought-provoking. I have a couple of questions from the floor, so I guess I'll turn to those first. I also have a few questions of my own for a beer afterwards. So the first of the questions is directed to Sabine, but it's I'm going to throw it open to everybody. And that is to say, is the sort of EU policy of open strategic autonomy really very different from the Trumpian approach, or the US approach? Let's not be value-ridden. So, distinguish in 30 words, difference between the EU and the US.
Actually, I think I do not need 30 words. I think the difference lies both in openness, strategy, and autonomy. All three elements are different from the way we see the trade policy of the Trump administration. Our objective is, we fully realize that we live in an interdependent world, and that in order to have autonomy, you need openness and you need to work with others. And autonomy is not autarky. That's why the word open to qualify the strategic autonomy is so important. But strategic in the sense also to say the objective or the ambition of the EU is to be able to chart its own course in world affairs, to work with others, but not to be obliged to choose a lane between either the US or China. Now, that doesn't mean that we treat these as equidistant, that we all share the same planet. We need everyone to work together, and the multilateral trading system with non-discrimination, MFN at its heart, ensures the predictability that we all need to grow out of this crisis and to ensure a sustainable future. So I think in all this you see that there is quite a big difference, because we are convinced that the way to manage trade issues is through negotiations, and preferably multilaterally, but there is a room for plurilateral agreements as long as they stay open. And we think that the alternative approach, which is to negotiate bilaterally and enforce unilaterally, does not deal with the enormous challenge that China poses for the world trading system. And we see that. If you look at structural issues, forced technology transfer, rampant subsidization, state-owned enterprises, you need mutually agreed rules to deal with that and an international system to enforce them. So I think that that should have made the fundamental difference clear enough.
Okay, thank you very much. It was very clear. I don't know if anybody else wants to add any further comments to that. No. I think that was very clear. So excellent, thank you. Let me move on then to the other question that I've got, and that is about subsidies, and it is rather open-ended. And so, where are we headed in future? You know, are we just going to have industrial policy upon industrial policy, or are the fiscal constraints eventually going to cause domestic forces to scale back and move to a much more conservative, in the traditional sense, a conservative position? I don't know if you want to start with that, Simon, and then I'll come to the others.
So I think the answer to this question is we're going to get both. In the short run, we will continue to see a ramping up of subsidization. And as I think my data showed you earlier, this had started well before COVID, and I think it will accelerate with COVID. So we will see more firms benefiting from selective subsidization rather than the sort of traditional across the board government initiatives. And this, I think we'll see this in not just in the goods sectors, but in the services sectors as well. And this will become an even bigger problem than it is at the moment. Now, the question also implies what's the corrective mechanism here? I have a fear and a hope. The fear is that some firms may decide that if their rivals are getting subsidies, it's a lot easier to go to their government. Sorry, if their foreign rivals are getting subsidies, it's a lot easier to go to their national governments and ask for a subsidy themselves than to bother to support a campaign at the WTO for tougher subsidy rules. So it might be easier for some firms or they may conclude that if you can't beat them, join them. In which case, we will essentially have much less pressure for increased, stronger WTO rules in this area. The hope is that at some point these subsidies mount up to be so much that finance ministries start worrying about them, and they get into the game and start in the name of fiscal rectitude and in the goal of reducing public deficits, they start urging ministers or causing subsidies to be phased out and rolled back. And so the hope then is that the political economy of subsidies changes once the finance ministries get involved. And I should add here that, of course, organizations like the IMF have a strong interest in public finances too, so they may become a player as well in this. And I think it's fair to say, without upsetting anyone present, that finance ministries are a lot stronger than trade ministries, and they're more likely to result in some type of restraint. Now, whether that happens sufficiently simultaneously so that we can make a global initiative out of this, we will see. But I think the hope has to be that fiscal consolidation leads to a rethink of the level of subsidization that we're seeing, not just from governments, but through national development banks, export-import agencies, and a wide range of different types of state bodies.
Okay, thank you. Caroline, Ken, anything to add?
Yeah, I'd like to come in on this as well. Just to add 2 points to what Simon said, I think one thing is some countries have a lot more money available for this than others. So it will exacerbate inequalities because it's really the richer countries that can do more to support firms and keep them alive. So I think this is something we have to think about now. And then the other point I wanted to make is just the importance of data, that as firms are getting more money, as state-owned enterprises are being propped up, that needs to be recorded. And what we recommend is to have annual reports by the government that cover exactly which firms are getting money and what they're getting and for how long, and these should be temporary and phased out. And firms that receive money need to report their financials so we really have the full picture, because if we don't have the full picture, we won't be able to monitor and discipline it. So those are the 2 points I wanted to add. Thanks.
Okay, thanks. Ken.
A couple of things to add. I mean, I agree with everything that's been said. Make 2 additional points. Yeah, I think we can expect more subsidies in the near term. I'm less hopeful that we'll hit fiscal limits because that will apply to, I guess, explicit subsidies, but governments are pretty creative. There's all kinds of implicit subsidies. So if I want to benefit the export of aluminum ladders, then I can impose exemptions from value-added taxes, export restrictions upstream on the major input into making ladders. So that will not show up in the fisc. That will show up through as a regulatory benefit that's very, very hard to uncover and estimate. So it's a complicated area for sure. I think there's an additional argument to hitting the fiscal impact, and that's the environmental consequences of subsidizing things that it makes no sense to do in either economic nor environmental terms. So we're talking about fishery subsidies. We're talking about agriculture subsidies. We're talking about subsidizing high cost, high environmental impact upstream sectors to allow cheap inputs downstream. So there is, I think, a growing market for understanding better the environmental as well as the financial and commercial consequences of ineffective subsidies. Thanks.
Thank you. Is there any chance of getting any international cooperation on in this area? You know, I hesitate to mention Brexit, but you know, I mean, there's a particular country that has suddenly found that it doesn't believe in cooperation on anything like this, and there are probably plenty others who agree. So supposing, I mean, I think the reservations, particularly that Ken's put forward, seem to me to be, you know, quite relevant. And remember, subsidies can be very targeted. In a sense, you can spend only a small amount of money and have a very large effect in some areas. So it really is going to need something pretty explicit internationally if we're to get transparency and so on. Is there a mechanism for that?
So if nobody else wants to touch that particular one, well, you know, one of the mechanisms, of course, is the WTO and the notifications, and the reality is that they're slow, they're incomplete, and they're much less satisfactory than the architects of the WTO had envisaged. So some of this may be left to some of us. And again, to come back to my former employer, we have invested enormously in making more transparent agricultural subsidies for 30 years. We know everything there is to know. I'm sorry, they know everything there is to know about agricultural support, which affects 1 or 2 or 3% of developed country economies. It's only in the last couple of years that we've begun to unpack industrial subsidies, looking across steel, aluminium, and semiconductors, for example. This is incredibly labor-intensive, complicated work, but somebody has to do it, and more people need to engage. I think there's an enormous market, and maybe Sabine will have some comments on this, but making information available to countries about what they and others do has to be in everybody's self-interest. But let me defer to Sabine.
Sabine.
Yeah, no, I'm happy to come in on this because this is actually an area in which we invested a lot already before the COVID crisis. And it is a very difficult issue. I agree that the first thing is to ensure that people respect the obligations in terms of notification they already have under the WTO. So let's start by having the WTO Secretariat police more the respect or non-respect of obligations by WTO members. I think they have been rather timid in doing that in the COVID crisis. And fortunately, you know, academics, think tanks jumped in and filled that gap on the restrictions on exports, or whether it was medical or food. But I think they need the WTO Secretariat needs to step up to that task. Then, of course, there is the question of the rules. And we had been working with the Americans and the Japanese to design a reinforcement of WTO rules on industrial subsidies with a view to ensuring a better level playing field, a more level playing field. Now, that came at a moment, and we had some successes. We managed to put forward a paper in January, and we were just about to discuss how to familiarize the rest of the WTO membership with that when the lockdown happened and COVID struck. This being said, Also inside the EU, the debate has been complicated by the resurgence of industrial policy in order to facilitate companies adjusting to new constraints on the Green Deal and digital. So there is more subsidization in the EU for these public policy aims. And secondly, of course, we have seen a rampant subsidization, a shoring up of companies in order to maintain jobs, etc., in the heat of the crisis. We need to now reassess our approach to these international disciplines in order to make sure that we capture what needs to be captured. Industrialization that leads to distortions, to overcapacities, etc., and hence entails a risk of protectionist responses by others, and then the risk of a spiral down into a situation which is more expensive for everyone. But I think we do need to look at, is there a case, dare I say it, for a sort of green box in subsidies, where you say there are legitimate public policy objectives that can only be achieved with that, and there are forms of subsidization which are as little trade distortive as possible. This is a much more complex discussion, but I think we need to have it. But the first thing is to have the transparency, and then to say, are there certain things that can be carved out? And on the other hand, we've been working with two categories so far, which is one category which is so blatantly distortive that they need to be prohibited. That is, subsidies to companies that are basically failing and are just drawing out their bankruptcy. Then there is another category of subsidies where you have a rebuttable assumption that they are trade distortive and hence should not go ahead. And then, as I said, maybe we have to have a category where we say, what are subsidies that are accepted? So I think we have a lot of very serious work ahead of us. And again, it will depend on how industrial policies are evolving around the globe. We are clearly in a different situation than in the early 2000s in this respect, or in the 1990s. Things have changed a lot here. And, we always have the swing of the pendulum. We now see much more subsidization across the board, at least in the developed countries, but also some emerging economies. So I think the case for an international discussion leading to international disciplines is stronger than ever.
Okay, thank you very much, Sabine. I see Caroline and Simon want to come in, and I'll then ask Bernard, who I think also wishes to comment. So Caroline, why don't you go first?
That was actually from before, and Mrs. Weyand said a lot of what I would have said. So.
Okay, thank you. How efficient. Simon.
So let me say two things. I mean, I strongly agree that we need to do much more in terms of documenting the subsidies which are out there. Of the, I think, 10 to 14,000 that my team has documented, most of them now are firm specific and extremely, very, very surgical in their impact. And Alan, you made that point, and I think you're absolutely right. We need to do a hell of a lot more work there. And I think over time, especially the last 5 years, the different people working in this area have become a lot more creative in documenting legitimately what subsidies are out there. And this work needs to carry on and be supported. The second comment I would make is that one could think about having a green box for certain types of subsidies. And I think that's an interesting idea, but I wouldn't just say, for example, allow subsidies for firms producing medical equipment so that they can hold excess capacity. For example, if they were to allow, and I'm not suggesting anyone's made that point, but if we were to allow that type of subsidy, I would also then want to link it to a commitment by the government doing the subsidy that they would not restrict exports above a certain percentage. So there could be in times of a pandemic, basically a deal which says that countries which are willing to bear some of the cost of maintaining excess capacity in the production of needed medical equipment and the like, medical kit, in order to get the pass on the subsidy rules, they have to commit not to restrict exports too much. And we can talk about how much too much is. And I think that type of deal might help, but it is so long as it's targeted to industries where there really is a risk that demand could surge for an essential item during a pandemic or some other crisis.
Okay, thank you. Bernard.
Yeah, thanks. I can't ask questions because I'm a co-host. I just discovered that, so I have to intervene. So I have a question for, and partly to reflect on the conversation, and a question to Mrs. Weyand. So on transparency and the role for the WTO, clearly notifications don't work. They haven't worked. They're not working now. So we've just been doing some work with Simon, which showed that less than 10% of everything that's been done by countries has been notified. So that is not there. So I think the question becomes, and it goes back to what Ken was talking about with AMIS and what Caroline was talking about in terms of the advice the World Bank gives to clients on what to do. It seems to me that on the one hand, the WTO Secretariat needs to get a mandate to actually do this. And they have been very hesitant, especially in the area of subsidies. And my understanding is that has been because the members don't want this to be done, or at least some members. So I think that calls for kind of a push, and clearly getting consensus on anything is very difficult, but I think there needs to be a critical mass where serious, large WTO members actually give a signal to the next DG. This is something we think the Secretariat should do and should be given a mandate to do, but also be given the resources to do. Right, so I've done a little bit of back of the envelope calculations here, and I think we have something like 60 lawyers right now who are working on dispute settlement issues. I think we have less than 15 PhD economists in the WTO who can actually do the type of analysis that is needed. So I think that's part of, there needs to be a rebalancing there. But I think the real question is, to what extent, I think it's very clear that the WTO cannot do this on its own, right? So they need to work with the bank, with the IMF, with the OECD. And do you see any kind of potential for actually pushing that through? Because I think that's the only solution, because clearly you can't reinvent the wheel. These other international organizations have a lot of the analytical capacity for the work that Ken has described and that the OECD has done very well on agriculture. So how do you see that moving forward? Because otherwise we can't just leave it to Simon. Simon is having great fun, I think, but he also has no weekends. I've been observing this. So we need to relieve the burden on Simon. Just a brief point on the green box. I agree completely that there needs to be a focus on that, because I cannot conceive of actually dealing with climate change without subsidizing. Right? Because the only way you can deal with climate change is to tax carbon. If you tax carbon, by definition, you're subsidizing other types of activities. So there needs to be a discussion around that. And I would maybe agree with Simon, is that trying to stick things in boxes, that works at a general level for some things, but we really need to move much more towards an effects-based approach, where we actually say, okay, let's think about what actually makes sense and what the effects are of different types of subsidies. And again, that takes me back to we need that analytical capacity in the institutions to do that work, because otherwise it's going to be driven by rent seeking. Thanks.
Just one point to respond to Bernard is that we do have a big project on subsidies and SOEs going on at the bank right now. And the OECD has done the fantastic work at the industry level, really getting granular in the details about specific companies. We're trying to be a bit more broad-based. The problem with that is, of course, you can look at who's complaining, but it's much harder to see, as Ken pointed out, because there's so many different ways of getting subsidies to firms, what's happening in detail. I think this is at least a start, because things that other countries complain about are obviously things that matter. So using countervailing duties, using the WTO trade reviews, using the European and US national trade reports, things like that, to just take the whole scope and try and put it all into one data source. So hopefully that can also help us get the picture of what's happening. It'll be really interesting to see how that changes in light of COVID.
Can I make a point from the chair? I mean, I think I agree with a lot of that, but I think you've got to be careful about sort of the dangers of universalism, which I think Simon alluded to, that if everybody is a sinner, actually not many people want to blow the whistle on sin. And we found in Europe, an independent function like the Commission actually is rather good at dealing with uncovering and then perhaps dealing with these things. So I certainly wouldn't think that it is sufficient to work off complaints. One actually does need, some independent expertise asking difficult questions. Perhaps some subsidized consumers to complain.
If I can come in on this.
Yes,
well, first of all, this is something which has been part of our reform agenda for the WTO for quite a while. And we've been working with others, including the US, on strengthening notification requirements by through a stick and carrot approach, basically making it clear that there are penalties one way or another attached to members not living up to their obligations. But we also have to, so I think this is something we would pursue, and I do think that there should be a critical mass for this sort of thing. At the same time, I think we need to keep an eye on the real problem we are trying to tackle, which is trade distortive, rampant subsidization. And I think that here the perfect should not be the enemy of the good. So that's why I think we need to give people the reassurance that it doesn't mean that they can no longer provide subsidies for essential public policy objectives. But that they have to first of all be transparent about what they do, and secondly, they should make this as little trade distortive as possible. And I think, in a way, take agriculture as an example. Of course, it's not perfect, but it has disciplined progressively the use of subsidization to quite an important degree. And I think that is what we need for industrial subsidies as well. So we haven't given up on that. It's a long-standing issue we've been working on. And of course, if the WTO Secretariat then hopefully gets all the information, they need to be equipped to deal with that. And they shouldn't do that on their own. There are indeed international organizations that have already invested in this. And they should be partnering up, obviously. So I think that is the way to go, but it is an issue which can only grow in importance. And I'm concerned that if we leave this unchecked, we will then see a rise of safeguard action and other protective measures or protectionist measures around the world.
Okay, thank you. Why don't we move on to something which is, I think, related, but not quite the same. There's a question here about the AMIS system. Ken, you particularly mentioned it, as if it would translate to the medical supplies issue. But isn't one of the questions that sort of medical supplies is a more heterogeneous and probably has many, many more headings to cover? And so, I mean, is it practical to think of a sort of a market information system for medical supplies?
So, making decisions absent any information gets us roughly where we are. Beginning to fill that gap with best available information will move us to a better place. So yes, I mean, AMIS covers 4 basic commodities. It covers G20 plus countries, but about 75–80% of global output across those major staples. So it's quite comprehensive. There are a small set of countries, very interdependent, responsible for the vast majority of PPE and medical equipment in the world. So it's not impossible, it's not easy, it's not automatic, but it is worth doing. Without the information, we just make it up as we go along. And that's that's a recipe for nothing good. If I could just make sort of two other comments on this wider discussion. If what we're doing is trying to inject transparency into the nature and the quantum of policies that governments introduce, and not determine a priori what's a good or a bad subsidy, what's trade distorting or not trade distorting, then I think I would be very comfortable with that stance. I think it's impossible to determine in advance what's a good and what's a bad subsidy. We need transparency on what's happening, and then analytically we can sort out what the positive and the negative effects of that might be. Second comment, I don't know how much more can or should be put on the WTO Secretariat. I think Sabine is right, this is the first best option, but maybe there's a market for international cooperation across IOs and institutes. I mean, maybe, Caroline, for example, you know, my former employer and your current employer and some others could do it a little bit more together rather than separate, not to try to converge on anything, but to leapfrog and make some advances using the different approaches that we both adopted. But I think discussing what the best approach is relatively futile. Kind of getting on and doing it and making some new mistakes and learning some things would be an approach that I would advocate at least. Thanks, Alan.
Thanks again. Simon, were you waving at me?
Yes, I was. I'd like to make two comments. First, on the AMS system here. You, Alan, made the point that there's such enormous heterogeneity across different types of medical kit and medical supplies. And some of these supply chains are incredibly complex for something like a ventilator. I think there's going to be real feasibility concerns raised here. On top of that, there are firms who deliberately do not know what goes on in their supply chain for liability reasons, and they don't want to know, and so they haven't collected this information, so there isn't much to share with governments. And then on top of that, the idea that many of these firms are going to be keen to hand over to governments what they do know about their supply chains, when there could be concerns that contains lots of commercial information which could be shared with rivals. I see many reasons why the AMIS benchmark will not be met, or is unlikely to be met with, unless there's a major change in how supply chains are organized, and the governance of them. So I'm all in favor of transparency, and I like the AMIS precedent, and I use it in my talks too. But having had to read into this over the last few months, I have some doubts about this. Okay. Maybe my second comment, I'll keep it very brief.
Cheer us up now, Simon. Say something nice. Say something cheerful.
Actually, I do want to say something cheerful, because it goes into the direction of not making the perfect the enemy of the very good. If you look at the EU's latest statement on foreign subsidies and how they're distorting markets, they have a really nice annex which defines what types of trade distorting subsidies we should be worrying about. And there's a nice test there in terms of commercial advantage. Is that conveyed upon a firm which is then, of course, undertaking international trade and commerce? And I think the most that we can hope to do is to be able to ascertain whether commercial advantage has been conveyed, rather than stepping back and saying, right, what's the right market structure model to estimate the consumer benefits and costs. That is a recipe for sending this issue into the grass for 10 years as economists fight over the methodology. The right way to go through this is to take that commercial advantage test, which is actually the test we use in one of the 7 tests we use at the Global Trade Alert, and just use it, scale it up. And it's very aligned with a pure implementation of the EU approach, which I think, quite frankly, has a lot of merit in this case.
Thanks very much, Simon. I see we've got to the end of our time and we are beginning to lose participants. So I'm going to come around and see if there's any last thing that any of you would like to say. But I want to set one last little exam question, which you might roll into your final comments. I mean, more or less, the theme of almost everyone's presentation was it's been going on for ages and COVID has just made it clear, or perhaps slightly worse. I mean, is there anything that we actually think that COVID really has changed, like Zooms instead of 747s? I mean, something big or something small, but I'd be interested to know if we really think it's just business as usual, or actually there are some new things to worry about. So why don't I go around, say, in reverse order from the way you spoke at first. So Caroline, let me come to you first.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to make a comment on Amos, because this is actually something that I'm proposing along with Christine McDaniel in an article for a book that Simon is editing with Richard Baldwin on how COVID is affecting the trade system and what can be done at the WTO. And I do think there's room for better information sharing, at least around the critical ingredients in pharmaceuticals and the ones that are scarce. And then the other place I think it can be used is for regulations. So when a vaccine gets approved by the FDA or whichever administration, it is going to go through many different steps. Yet regulators don't often share those steps, and that leads to delays between approvals elsewhere. So I think there can also be better sharing around the regulatory processes. So it's just a point I wanted to throw in there, because I do think information is critical to solving some of these problems, exactly as it was with Amos. And then in terms of Alan's question, I think the big change is around digital. And some of it might be more at the national economy level in terms of if there's more home-based work and how that's going to affect rental rates and transit and other things. But I think in terms of trade, it's really this opening for services that we've all been waiting for the last 20 years, for services to really be traded. Because in the past, if Bernard invited me to this conference and I wasn't able to go to Florence, I would have said, sorry, another time. Instead, we're all here, and there've been these great webinars. I've heard from lots of companies that say they'll never fly in anyone for an interview again. I think at the World Bank, we're not going to be flying for 2-hour meetings with finance ministers, things like that. I think we're going to be doing a lot more of this online, but that has good spillovers in productivity. But just as another example of how these things cascade, business travel subsidizes tourism. So tourism is being hit in a number of ways, but going forward, it's business travel that subsidizes hotel rates and air rates for tourists, and that's going to be hit as business travel may be curtailed. So there's lots of these kind of spillovers that I said at the beginning. I think it'll be interesting to have this discussion again in 5 years and look back. Hopefully this will be over by then, and look back on what we've learned. But thanks, I think this has been a great discussion.
Thank you. Ken.
Okay, so I don't at all think it's business as usual in any sense. Some of the issues being confronted are familiar. So the subsidy story and the GVC story, but there's an urgency that we didn't dream about 6 months ago that I think is confronting all of us. And I agree completely with Caroline. If you take on the more positive side of an impact from the last 6 months, the rapid increase in digitalization, the realization that I haven't had, well, when I still worked at the OECD, I hadn't had any staff in the office for 6 months. There was barely a hiccup in the output and the apparent productivity. A couple of guys, a couple of folks had husbands or wives that were in the medical business and small children, so that took a bit of a hit. But beyond that, we were well able to do research and analytical work without talking to each other in person, and that we didn't know that before. And as Caroline says, I don't think we're all going back. Mm-hmm. The area that I don't know, and maybe Sabine will comment on this, but the implications of COVID for the way countries choose to address climate change and issues of environmental sustainability. I think it's an enormous question, but it's one that I certainly don't have an answer for.
Okay, thank you. Simon.
So Alan, I think to answer your question, I think the biggest area of change is actually in our thinking about the world trading system, not necessarily in the policy which have been undertaken. I pointed out earlier how it has been a sharp shift in policymaker attitudes towards GVCs. Now, whether that's sustained or not, we'll have to see. But the consistency of this over the last 6 months is a profound change, which we will have to watch. Another area where I think thinking has changed has actually been amongst us analysts. If we went back 5 years ago, there were very few of us charting and showing that this system was getting into real trouble. And there was a general view that the WTO is doing a pretty good job. I mean, you can document this in the writings of leading analysts and the like. Then we had the trade war, and then depending on which side you're on, you can choose that you can say one nation or the other or both went rogue. But then the argument was it was their problem, and the WTO is still doing great. In 2020, does anyone honestly say this anymore and to keep a straight face? So there's been one of these really serious, profound shifts, I think, in how people talk about the WTO, and a recognition that this is a worthy institution that is in quite serious trouble. And I think for those of us who, like myself, who've been pointing out the termites in the system have been there for a long time, this is a really welcome change, because now we don't have people dying in a ditch to defend the WTO because they happened to be around when the Uruguay round was completed. We now actually have people looking at this problem slightly more rationally, and that is because I think we have better data, and we've been confronted with a shock which has forced us to revisit our assumptions. So my bottom line is our thinking has changed, even if the policy rot was already there.
Okay, thank you. So, Sabine.
I don't have a crystal ball, and I think it's a question we can only answer with hindsight in perhaps 5 years' time. But I do agree with Caroline. I think the biggest shift will be in the world of trade. In the world of work, and we have to see what that means for trade. But I'm not even sure whether the way we work now will really be that influential in the end, because you can already see now, it's fine to do a webinar where everyone is connected. Hybrid events are horrible. And I think the more people will go back to physical meetings once this pandemic is over, the quicker we will all return to this. But I agree, there will be things which we will no longer be doing. We will fly around half the globe for a meeting of 2 hours. On services, though, one element is that obviously we have a limitation on the movement of people, and a lot of services are actually provided by people. So I'm not sure that this is just a benefit for trade in services. There are also countervailing forces here. And in terms of thinking about the world trading system, this is perhaps more a hope than an analysis. And that is that every crisis also offers a chance to reconsider positions and to try to turn this into something positive. And I hope that that is also the spirit. And I hope that we will see that with the appointment of the WTO Director General, and with hopefully an MC12 that provides a pathway towards success for the WTO. But as I said, this is not an analysis. This is a hope that we learn to grab the chances provided by this current crisis.
Well, thank you very much. That's a nice note to end on. It's been an excellent session. Let me thank all 4 speakers and the people who raised questions. Lots to think about, even more to do, I think. So with that, let me end this session, and I presume I hand back to Bernard, who I see is hovering on the screen. So well done, Bernard, for organizing this. Any last words from you?
No, I just wanted to thank all of you. I wanted to thank the participants. And of course, one of the downsides of this model is that we only have the participants who are listening to this particular session. And of course, we've had hundreds throughout the course of the day and yesterday. So I am sending a thank you out there into the ether, and hopefully they will they will come back to look at some of the recordings and the discussions. So I very much hope that next year we can do this in Florence, which is the plan. And I will certainly come back to all of you with respect to inviting you to Florence and to do this in a much more convivial environment than we are doing it at the moment. So thanks again.
Thank you very much. And Goodbye.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.